Hello, and welcome to Change the Face of Yoga, teaching toddlers through golden oldies. I'm very excited to be talking to lots of yoga teachers who will explain their passion for teaching yoga to students with different ages, physical fitness levels, wellness levels, and different goals. They will explain the benefits of yoga for these students and will be including teacher tips and pose modifications. I am Stephanie Cunningham of Yoga Lightness, and I've been teaching over 50s for 10 years. So this area is my passion and the passion of many other yoga teachers that you will be listening to in this series. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get started. This is episode 29 of Changing the Face of Yoga. I am interviewing Flo Fenton of In Touch Yoga in Byron Bay. She is a yoga teacher, yoga therapist, and does provide yoga teacher training. She has some suggestions for people who are contemplating teacher training. Let's listen. Hello. I want to welcome our wonderful guest today. It's Flo Fenton. And Flo is quite well known for all of the many things that she does. She's a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist. And her focus is on finding our natural ease within the postures and on cultivating an ever-deepening awareness of the relationship between the body, the breath, and our state of mind. Flo runs classes, workshops, retreats, teacher trainings, and yoga therapy sessions. And her website, which I will repeat toward the end of the session, is www.intouchyogabyronbay.com. What Flo and I are going to be talking about today is, this is part of the series on teacher training, which I think a lot of people are talking about these days. And Flo has some very specific opinions on teacher training, many of which I share. And we're just going to talk about where she sees the status of yoga teacher training. Welcome, Flo. Is there anything else you'd like to add to your introduction?
No, I think that's about it. You've covered everything.
Okay, great. I was in your website and I found a very interesting statement, which was, there are many teacher trainings out there. They broadly fall into two categories: those that are run purely as a business venture and aim to attract the largest number of students possible for the minimum outlay to the school per student, and those that are offered with a sincere desire to impart knowledge at the highest standard possible. That's a pretty strong statement. What is your...
Okay. Yeah, you might be right. I mean, I didn't really think it was something that anyone would really contest, because to me it's very clear that there are many schools that are operating very much from a business model. I teach trainings and retreats at different venues, and at some of those venues there are also much larger schools than I running their trainings. And in a space where I would consider 15 students would be an absolute maximum in terms of, the amount of space a student can have to do their own practice and have enough space to actually move around on their mat and have props, and also to get that kind of student-teacher contact that I would deem to be a minimum. There are other schools in the same space running trainings where they have upwards of 50 students in that same space. It's, to me, very clear that their focus, it's not the same as mine.
How would someone know if they wanted to take teacher training? What kinds of things should they be looking for?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think it's really up to each student when they're researching teacher trainings to ask these questions themselves. So one of the questions that they would be wise to ask would be, what is the maximum number of students you allow on each training, and how many teachers do you have on the floor during practice and during lecture time? So, they can get an idea of how much personal attention they're going to be likely to get. that's one of the questions I would definitely be asking. The other thing to really look into, I think, is the amount of actual face to face hours that you're getting with a school or with a teacher. I think one of the things which I find a little depressing is that it seems to be the way of things that a lot of teacher trainings are going more towards having the majority of the content delivered in an online or distance format. Now, I understand that in terms of everybody needs to make a living, and I'm certainly not, bagging anyone out for needing to make a fair income for running trainings, because that certainly is tricky. However, it just saddens me. When I did my training, I did my first teacher training. I've done a few. I did the first one with yoga arts in 1999. And that was before we had these bodies like Yoga Australia and Yoga Alliance deeming what would be the minimum number of hours per training that would be needed to qualify someone. And, as you know, nowadays it's 200 hours or 350 hours. My training was 9 months every day, and I added it up. It was probably 3,500 hours of training, and that was all face to face. And I can tell you that the teachers that did those trainings before the new legislation came in from those bodies mentioned, those teachers, they're the teachers that we've all heard about. They're the teachers that people now go to for teacher trainings, for workshops. And I just think, what is the future of teaching in Australia if all of our current trainees are only doing 200 hours and the majority of that is online? Are we going to have these amazing teachers in the future for other trainees to learn from?
Good point, yes. Someone else on another podcast made the point that dental hygienists, at least in the United States, have to have 2,000 hours of training. And yet we only ask 200, or as you say, 350 hours for a yoga teacher who really has a great deal more opportunity to interact with students, their whole body. And, if you're really into the yoga, their mind and the breath and all of that.
I think it's really part of raising our credibility. I think the first stage in raising our credibility and the quality of what we offer as yoga teachers is really to raise the standard of our teacher trainings. And, that may be in the future to raise the minimum number of hours. That would be one thing that could definitely be addressed, I think. But the other, perhaps most important thing is just making sure that the quality of the teaching that's going ahead within those hours and the content of what's being given on those teacher trainings is up to standard and is something which is actually going to hold firm for the students that are learning it and actually serve them and enable them to go out and become great teachers.
Can you give us an example of that?
Look, I can only give you an example of what I think isn't good. Before I started running my own trainings, and to be honest, the reason I started running my own trainings in 2010 was really because I had taught on a number of other teacher trainings as a member of the faculties there, as a teacher of asana and pranayama, and also as a yoga therapist. And I found that on a lot of the trainings that I was asked to teach on, there was a few issues there. One was that the minimum standard of prior learning wasn't being kept up. So I think Yoga Australia have a minimum requirement that there needs to be prior at least 1 year that the student has been regularly practicing yoga before they undertake a training. And I think with Yoga Alliance it's 2 years. And on some of those trainings, the students were they were just new to yoga. They really hadn't done much yoga. And when I asked the people running the training about that, they said, oh, that's okay because they're only really doing the training for their learning. They're not going to go out and teach. But the point is they were still going to be given a certificate to say that they'd completed the training at the end. So they could have gone out and taught, even though they really weren't prepared to, build on any knowledge that they already had. So that was one issue. And yeah, another issue would be the content. I mean, I don't necessarily think, there's any right or wrong, but there's definitely a lot of different opinions out there on a lot of different subjects that we have on the curriculum of yoga teacher trainings, and there's not a lot of consistency. And as far as I can see, there isn't actually any policing, if you like, of what is actually being taught, the content. I mean, Yoga Australia certainly have very high standards, and they ask for people to submit the curriculum in terms of the number of hours that they are going to put into each subject for each teacher training, and they do a really good job in that way. But as far as I understand it, it's not as if anyone's actually going to read the fine print and actually look at the content of what's being taught. And it may be that, some of the content that's being taught isn't what's currently deemed to be the most modern understanding. There's always change in the yoga community. Some of the students that I get on my level 2 training that have completed their level 1 training with another school come to me with understanding of asana practice, for example, that I would say was outdated and no longer useful and possibly even may cause injury.
This is something I used to do in another life, but one of the ways that you look at the quality of a educational offering of almost any kind is to ask the students who have graduated and then have gone out and probably or possibly taught. Has Yoga Australia ever asked you for that kind of information? If you've surveyed your graduates?
They haven't, but I think that would be a really good idea. I personally try to maintain contact with my graduates, and, a number of my past graduates have their own schools now and teach in the local area as well as interstate and some of them overseas. I try to offer workshops and other events where they can actually touch base with me again and, maintain some kind of contact, because I just think that that's one of the things that might be missing in current teacher trainings is that kind of ongoing support and also that kind of contact with the teacher and an ongoing relationship with the teacher. So I try to do that. But as far as whether there is actually any sort of auditing, if you like, of the fitness of a graduate to teach, I think there isn't, but I think that would be a good idea. Yeah,
it's a hard thing to logistically carry out, but it actually is very helpful often for the schools because they may not have realized,
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, all I can say is
that
again, on my both my level 1 and my level 2 trainings, I regularly get graduates of other trainings. Some people come and do my level 1 when they've already done another level 1 because they don't feel that they have the skills yet or the confidence to teach, even though they've done a training. They sort of feel like they need to do another training before they can actually go out and teach. And I think that's a failing. My intention is after the level 1 training, they are able to teach. Throughout the training, they actually have to design and practice and teach several classes. So I've seen them, they've taught in front of other students. They've sort of, had the chance to check that out and feel how it feels and have feedback as well from the other students and from myself and learn from their mistakes before they then are thrown out into the world and into teaching their own classes without any guidance.
I agree. I offer something that after you've had your basic training to teach seniors, and that is the biggest problem, is how to get the confidence level up, because I think people intrinsically understand that well, yoga is a wonderful thing. If it's done incorrectly, you can hurt yourself.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I agree with that. If we're not giving them the confidence,
I think
the
that's
training.
one of the downfalls of those larger trainings because logistically, if you've got 30 to 50 students in a class, there's no way that each one of those students is going to be able to get up in front of the class and teach an hour or an hour and a half. You know, you might be able to separate them into smaller groups and they can do it that way, but often there isn't the amount of physical space that's possible. So basically what happens is the larger the number of trainees, the lower the number of practice teaching hours each trainee is actually going to get.
Is there a requirement under Yoga Australia and or Yoga Alliance
There
to have
is,
practice
there
teaching?
is. For the level one training, I think it's 20 hours that they have to do of practice teaching. On my training, they do many more than that. But again, this is the sort of thing that I feel really needs to be policed because, as I said, I know from teaching graduates of other trainings and hearing what actually happened on their training that doesn't always happen. They don't always get those teaching practice hours.
My impression of my very first yoga teacher training was we kind of dipped our toes into lots of different things, but there wasn't really any depth to it.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the way it has to be because yoga is really complex and holistic, and we are learning in lots of different areas. But looking back on it, at the time I was kind of, this is all so much new stuff. Looking back on it though, I kind of wonder if it wasn't a bit shallow.
Yeah.
And how can that be addressed? Perhaps more hours, I don't know, but
I think definitely making sure that there's the minimum requirement of practice teaching hours and all of the things that go with that. You know, I know that on some trainings, again, speaking to students who've graduated from other trainings, I know that on other trainings, part of their teaching practice is just to teach sort of public classes at the school that they're adjoined to, but they might not have actually done any preparation for that class. It's almost like they just sort of rock up and they just sort of fudge it through. So on my training, I try to give them, for each class that they teach, there's an assignment that they have to think of a group of people they're going to teach. They have a theme or a goal for the class. They have to construct the sequence with a logical warm-up, core phase, and cool down phase. They have to submit that to me, and we go through several emails back and forth where I'll suggest, either different asanas or different alternatives or different prop use until we come up with something which we both feel really makes sense and nails the goals of their class. Then they practice by themselves, and then they finally teach that class to their fellow students. So, and then they get feedback. So that's sort of a whole process. And that, if you think about it, is what you need to do each time you teach any kind of class, or, in the future, hopefully you're going to be teaching also longer events like workshops or maybe even retreats. And there's a lot of planning and thought that goes into that, which I feel might be missed out on some teacher trainings.
if we extend the hours to get some in-depth practice to build confidence and knowledge, shall we say. It's like a chicken or an egg because there's so many yoga teachers at this point that most people can't make a living out of it.
Yeah.
And to ask them then to go to school for the training for 3 to 4 to 5 times longer than they do now, I understand that it's a difficult problem, but how do we transition to that, to say this is what we think and what we need for a yoga teacher training, and then to turn it around and say, and yes, it will come back to you monetarily, which is not the most important thing, but it certainly is necessary.
Yeah. Well,
That,
look, I
you
think
know,
there's a few things there. I mean, if you think about a physiotherapist, for example, I mean, there's thousands and thousands of physiotherapists out there, but they're not really competing with each other. Partly that's because they are respected as professionals. The other part of that is some of their services are bulk billable. You know, this is something which Yoga Australia is also trying to bring in, is that if we can accredit ourselves sufficiently, and that might be down to increasing our training hours and the level of skill that we all enter the workforce with to begin with, then perhaps we will be seen in the same light as a physiotherapist, and people will be able to claim for part of our teaching or our treatment. So that might be one way that we would actually be able to earn a better living from what we do now, is by actually making ourselves more qualified to begin with. And the other possibility is, I mean, Yoga Australia already have what I think is a really good proviso for their trainings, which is that there's a minimum of 1 year from when you begin your training to when you complete your training, that you have to be in contact with the teacher. So Yoga Alliance have no provision for that. So someone can come along and do a 1 month, 200-hour training, or some people even jam it into, a few weeks. And then they can just go off and teach with no further contact with their teacher. Whereas it actually takes time. It takes time to build skills. And it's really great if you've got access to mentoring. So Yoga Australia have included that as part of any training that's less than 1 year. You have to do mentoring with your teacher, and that can include things like just turning up to class and assisting, and you learn a lot that way. I offer this for my teacher trainees because my training goes for 9 months, 1 day a week from March through to December, and then for the few months that's left to take it up to the 1 year mark, they can come and assist me on retreats, on workshops, in my classes, and maybe even during private sessions. And so they get to learn from all of those different scenarios and teaching styles. And part of that is that also sort of learning some of the business aspects of yoga and some of the interpersonal skills, for example, that you need, and some of the logistics things that you need to know when you're actually setting these things up. So, I think mentoring is a big part of it, and we could perhaps look at increasing the number of years, or the number of hours that a student needs mentoring before they're fully qualified.
who's providing this mentoring? I mean, would everyone be able? Obviously, you're mentoring your students, but you've said that you maintain a smaller group for purposes of better teaching. All these people that come out, and I have no idea how many people are actually coming out of yoga training schools each year, but
Yeah.
where would they find a mentor?
It can be any senior level 3 accredited Yoga Australia teacher. So that's the way Yoga Australia do it. They have different levels of experience with their registered teachers. For example, I'm a level 3 teacher because of the number of years I've been teaching and the number of hours I've taught over those years, and the fact that I provide teacher training. So a level 3 teacher, any level 3 teacher, you could get mentoring hours with. It doesn't have to be the provider of your training. So if you moved, or if you weren't local to where you did your training, you could still get those mentoring hours somewhere locally, perhaps with a different teacher who is a level 3 registered Yoga Australia teacher.
I've seen that they required mentoring, but I never, I guess, got into it deep enough to actually figure out how it worked.
Yeah.
But
I mean, there's different ways it can work. It can just be, a phone call, or it can be a group where you ask questions and, the teacher tries to provide answers to questions that come up when you start teaching. That's one way you can do it, sort of like a support group, if you like. I sort of do that anyway. Just, students can always email me and ask me questions about things. I've got graduates from the last several years of training that sometimes email me and say, oh, I've got this client or this student who's got this particular physical condition that maybe they've never worked with before, and they just ask for a few little pointers or tips, and I try to help them. That's one way. But yeah, as I said, I think actually showing students the ropes, even if they just observe. But it's great if, if you can make it sort of hands-on, so they're actually part of helping to set up and helping to service the students' needs within a class or a workshop or retreat. It's really good learning. I mean, I sort of look at that now and I think, wow, I would have loved to have gotten that kind of insight, into teaching and how to you really run that part of the business before I started, instead of having to sort of invent the wheel myself. So I think it's a really valuable form of learning.
So let's kind of go into what Yoga Australia does,
Yeah.
because I'm quite surprised to hear about this, because I think it's important that there is some oversight after the initial approval of getting a teacher training course approved by Yoga Australia. But what are they doing now?
Okay, so yeah, I was also unaware of this, even though I'm a Yoga Australia registered teacher and I provide Yoga Australia registered training courses. This was something that wasn't apparent to me till I started inquiring about, what are Yoga Australia actually doing to uphold standards for our trainings, which was something that I was concerned about. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear that Yoga Australia has just recently formed a training working group, and they've just completed the documents and processes for undertaking desktop auditing of all Yoga Australia training courses, and they're beginning these audits sort of as we speak. And the intention is that they're going to undertake at least one face-to-face audit on the premises of a training school each year, which is a very thorough process that takes many hours. And they also have a grievance process. So this is really important for students of trainings to know, or even just students who go along to an open class at a school. If they have any kind of grievance, so if they weren't treated fairly, if they don't feel that their training that they were provided was as it was advertised, if they don't feel that the training that they were given was up to standard in any way, or if there were any ethical concerns, any of these things, there's a grievance process to address it. And Yoga Australia do actually have a grievance process where they will do a face-to-face audit of that training school. If they receive any kind of complaint or grievance, they will actually investigate it and be the body who will sort that out and look into it.
Okay, what do you mean by a desktop audit?
I believe that desktop auditing would be, so they're not face-to-face, so they're just looking at the documents, they're asking to see evidence of what's being taught, the hours that are being taught, all of that stuff. Whereas a face-to-face audit, I believe, would be actually going to the school and looking at what's actually happening at the school and what's being done during the training.
Do you know how many teacher training organizations there are, different ones there are in Australia? I'm just wondering how long it's going to take them to get
Yeah,
along
sure.
around
No,
to
it's a good
everyone.
point. Yoga Australia has approximately 5,100 teaching and non-teaching members, 100 training programs approximately from yoga schools across Australia and New Zealand. And they're mostly run by volunteers. They do have a small paid staff, but there's volunteers that do this work as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. It's really quite a lot to ask.
It is a lot to ask, but I know
Yeah.
I know the president and I know some of the people who implemented Yoga Australia, and they're very sincere and full of integrity. So, I think that's the primary reason that they set it up, was to try to make sure that there was a standard and that standard is going to be maintained, and also for safety, for student safety and for the safety of the public.
What would you feel would be the perfect teacher training?
Well, if I'm honest, I'd say it would be a much longer training. As I said, my own training that I did, the first one I did was 9 months. It was every day, sort of 6 a.m. till 6 p.m. We had Sundays off. Uh, but, it's that sort of level of commitment and discipline. I think you don't see that in yoga students these days. I think it's a little bit of a different world now. I don't think you'd be able to run a training like that these days. Somehow things have sort of changed. But my perfect training realistically would be definitely of a minimum of 1 year of contact, which, yep, we already do that. I'm pretty satisfied with what I'm doing right now, which is 1 day a week and lots of contact between myself and the students and lots of time for them to practice and practice teaching. I think, the results sort of speak for themselves. I have a high number of graduates that actually do go straight out and teach and start up their own schools and their own classes. And also, what I think is really important is they know how to differentiate themselves. So it's not just everybody trying to offer the same thing, which is this kind of, vague thing of, we're teaching yoga. It's important to differentiate oneself so that you're offering something specific and unique and you attract your own client base, which is specific to what you're doing. So yeah, I think as long as it's over a longer period, I think that's the main thing. I mean, I do also offer intensives, and I think the intensives work well for students who have quite a lot of prior understanding of yoga and a lot of prior practice. I notice that older students and students that have been practicing yoga for upwards of 5 or 10 years, they can do like a 1 month intensive, and they just kind of they suck up the knowledge because they're sort of primed and ready for it. It doesn't work that well to try and do an intensive if you're sort of fairly new to yoga within the first 5 years, say. And also, just for younger students, they just don't seem to have the same ability or stamina, maybe, to go that more intense schedule. So I think, realistically, the longer term trainings are better. For most people, they are more effective in terms of learning skills to teach and getting confidence to teach, and understanding all of the things that you need to understand to be able to go out and not just teach a great class, but interact with students and build a business and maintain your clients and your students so that you're actually able to make a living out of yoga.
That's a great point. That's really a great point, that it's also the business issues that are critical to your confidence and your ability to be really,
Yeah,
to really teach. I think we often forget that,
yeah.
that you get so involved in yoga that you don't realize.
I
And
often find, it's some of the most successful yoga teachers that I know in terms of how many students they get, how many classes they run, how many events they run, how much money they make. Some of the most successful yoga teachers I know in that way are not by any means the best at asana or even the best at teaching asana. They're just good at networking and they're good at people skills and they're good at seeing what's needed and providing it. So all of those things are a big part of running a business that you will make your living from.
Flo, this has been really fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. For those of you that would like to get in touch with Flo, perhaps to talk to her more about her trainings and her workshops and her retreats, her email is flo@intouchyogabyronbay.com. Her website is www.intouchyogabyronbay.com. And Flo, is there anything you'd like to add to the podcast?
To say that, yeah, if any students are interested in asking me more about my trainings or any advice really on looking for teacher trainings perhaps in their own area, then feel free to contact me. So it's flo@intouchyogabyronbay.com, or just go to the website and all the contacts are there on the contact page.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate coming on the podcast and giving us your extensive knowledge and talking about teacher training, because it can be a little touchy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Flo.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you for that wonderful interview. If you would like to be a guest on Changing the Face of Yoga, please go to my website, www.yogalightness.com.au, and under the Changing the Face of Yoga tab, you can complete Be Our Guest form. After reviewing the form and finding it applicable to this podcast, we will send you a link to schedule an interview. Please download, review, and tell your friends of any podcasts that are of interest to you and to them. If you would like to contact me, send an email to info@yogalightness.com.au. And thank you for listening to Changing the Face of Yoga.